Hello and welcome back to the Volunteer Income Tax Training Series. My name is Chris Moon. I am an associate teaching professor in the Ivy College of Business at Iowa State University. This video is going to focus on dependents and who taxpayers can claim as dependents. The first screen that you're seeing here is another excerpt from the intake form that we have already talked about, and I talked about this in the intake video, making sure that if a client has anyone who lives with them, aside from the situation I talked about with just college roommates, but if the taxpayer has people who live with them, that they are listed in this section of the intake form, and that as the preparer, you go through this shaded section to determine whether or not the person who's living with them can be claimed as a dependent. So there is a section in Link and Learn for additional resources where you can get more information about dependents. Section C of your 4012 talks about dependents and the rules for claiming dependents, and we'll go through some of those in this lesson, but obviously we can't cover everything, so if you have certain questions about whether or not a dependent can be claimed, Section C of your 4012 is where you want to look for that. So we will take the time in this video to talk about who can be claimed as a dependent. We'll talk about qualifying child tests, qualifying relative tests, and then special rules related to children of divorced parents. All right, so you probably know this if you've been doing taxes for the last year, but the dependency exemptions are actually reduced to 0 through 2025 by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But even though the exemption amounts are 0, there are still benefits for claiming dependents, and so we want to go through and we would still want to list any dependents that could be claimed on the return, because there may be additional deductions or credits or benefits to the taxpayer that we want to make sure they get. So, taxpayer can either claim a qualifying child or a qualifying relative. 3 tests apply to both of these. And then, so we're going to apply these 3 tests, and then there's going to be different tests that apply to qualifying child than the tests that apply to qualifying relative. All right. So the 3 tests that apply to both qualifying child and relative is dependent taxpayer, joint return, and citizen or resident. The 5 additional tests that apply to qualifying child are relationship, age, residency, support, and qualifying child of more than one person, and we'll talk about what to do if that happens. And the qualifying relative tests that apply if it's not a qualifying child are the member of household or relationship gross income test and support test. So let's talk about what each of these tests that I just referenced mean. So the dependent taxpayer, you can't claim any dependents if you could be claimed as a dependent by another taxpayer. All right, so if you can be claimed as a dependent, you can't claim dependents. You can't claim a married person who files a joint return as a dependent unless that joint return is only to claim a refund of income tax withheld. Also, you can't claim a person as a dependent if that person is, unless that person is a U.S. citizen, U.S. resident alien, U.S. national, or resident of Canada or Mexico. And we actually, we see a fair amount of questions on this at the ISU site, because we do have a lot of taxpayers who come to Iowa State University from other countries, and at whatever point they are able to file taxes as a resident, if they have children who are not U.S. citizens or resident aliens, they're not able to claim those children on their tax return. All right, the 5 additional tests for a qualifying child are: 1, the relationship. So the child must be your child, stepchild, foster child, sibling, half-sibling, step-sibling, or descendant of any of those. Also, just as a note, an adopted child is always treated as your own child. Number 2, the age restriction. So the child must be under the age of 19 at the end of the year and younger than you or your spouse if you're filing jointly, or under the age of 24 at the end of the year, a full-time student, and younger than you or your spouse. So if you do have a child who is between 18 and 24, but they're a full-time student, they would still qualify under this rule. Or the last age restriction is the child can be any age if they are permanently and totally disabled. All right, so residency, the child must have lived with you for more than half the year, and this is includes temporary absences. So if you have, for example, a 20-year-old child who is away at college, the child living at college counts as a temporary absence, so they are considered to be living with you during that time that they're temporary absent at college, and you can still claim them as a dependent. The support test, the child must not have provided more than half of his or her own support for the year. So you or someone else is providing more than half of the support for the child. The child isn't providing more than half of their own support. And then there are a set of rules if the child qualifies for more than one person. So if the child is a qualifying child of more than one person, then there are tiebreaker rules. I'm not going to go through each one of those, but I will tell you if it's a qualifying child for a parent and an aunt, the parent is going to trump. Like, that's one of the tiebreaker rules. But you can look on page C4 of your 4012, and there are a number of tiebreaker rules that you can look through there. All right, so qualifying relative test is different than qualifying child test. So the first 3 rules apply, but then the next rule that applies is that it is not a qualifying child. So I just went through the rules for who a qualifying child is. So if this person is not any of those, it meets the first test. Then it must be a member of household or have a relationship. So it's really important, if you're trying to determine that if the client has a dependent or not, that you just take the time to go through. You can go through this worksheet for determining support. You can go through section C of your 4012 to determine whether or not it's a qualifying relative. So in the second test for qualifying relative, the person is either related to you in one of the ways listed under relatives who don't have to live with you, which is on table 2, step 2 of the 4012, or must live with you all year as a member of your household. So they must be living with you the entire year. The third test is gross income. So the person's gross income for the year must be less than $5,200. And then the final test is you must provide more than half of the person's total support for the year. So just as an example, I have a very, what I think is unique situation that happens. I think for the past 4 or 5 years, I've had this person come into the tax clinic. The person has a significant other who earns 0 income, no disability, no job, nothing. So this person is not a qualifying child. This significant other is a member of her household for the entire year. Gross income obviously less than $5,200 because this person has no income, and the taxpayer provides more than half the support. So in this circumstance, the taxpayer can claim her boyfriend as a dependent because he meets all of these qualifying relative tests. So that's a pretty unique situation. Sometimes we'll see it with like an aunt or an uncle or some other relative that is not a qualifying child, where the taxpayer is providing all the support or most of the support, and the person living with them doesn't have very much income at all. So just make sure you go through each one of those in determining whether or not it is a qualifying relative. All right, so let's just quickly talk about some special rules for divorced or separated parents. There are some special rules that apply to children of divorced or separated parents. A lot of times you may have a situation where a client will come in and they will say that they have a divorce agreement that allows them to claim one or more of their children as dependents. And so that would be a situation where they're able to claim the child as a dependent. Understanding the difference between custodial and non-custodial parent is important. So the divorce decree itself may describe the custodial relationship in a number of different ways. Even in Iowa, it can be described in a number of different ways depending on how that decree was written. But the custodial parent is the parent who has the child living with them for more than half of the year. They are, the child is mainly living with that parent. The non-custodial parent would then have what we would generally call visitation or parenting time outside of where the child lives. The custodial parent does have the ability to release a claim to the exemption. That is done on Form 8332. So if you have someone who is claiming a child and they are not a custodial parent, you would want to see that there is a release of claim to the exemption for the child when you are preparing that return and allowing the taxpayer to claim the child on the return. All right, so this is just a summary of dependents, and it's really important to make sure that you are listing anyone who could be a dependent. If you have anyone who is in the United States from another country that's filing as a resident, make sure that you know whether or not that child can be claimed as a dependent. So knowing that the child is either a resident or a U.S. citizen or meets one of those other qualifications. Otherwise, that return is either going to be rejected or it'll get sent back later to the client, and request for a repayment of a refund potentially could happen. So those are really important issues to discuss with the client. All right, thank you.